Good morning, y'all. I'm not going to give you permission to not greet me. Good morning. Hannah was a little too soft on y'all. Well, my name is Hannah Tom. I'm the spiritual formation and teaching pastor here at DCC, and really excited to be with you all. It's been a little while since I taught, because I did not teach during our summer series, so I am excited to be with you again in this capacity. Now, this morning, as we are in this new season of kids going back to school, I thought I could start us off with a little bit of audience participation. I know that's everyone's favorite. All I'm going to ask you to do, though, nobody get nervous. I promise you already know the right answer. We're just going to play a little fill in the blank. I'm going to start a sentence, and you're going to finish it. Ready? This morning, we are going to be picking up our text in the book of Luke. Loud and proud, everyone. Thank you very much. Yes, we are picking up our text in the book of Luke. Now, if you've been with us for a while, you know that this is typically the part of the sermon where I make fun of our lead pastor, Michael, for the fact that we have been in the book of Luke for about 3 years now. That was not a joke. I didn't make that up. That was a real amount of time that we have been in the book of Luke. But this morning, instead of making fun of Michael, as is my custom, what we're going to do is just take a minute to really think about this. 3 years. That's about how long the disciples that we're going to read a story about today have been following Jesus at this point. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of my own life, and I think of the last 3 years, I think of September 2021 to now, a lot has changed. I was moving back to Colorado in September of 2021. I was starting a house church, working a 9 to 5 as a recruiter. I have since added a dog to my family. I have bought and sold a condo, bought a house. My husband and I have both changed jobs. I think I just ticked off at least 3 or 4 of those major life changes that everyone says, this is going to cause a lot of stress in your life. And I imagine, as you're thinking about your own life, as you're thinking about the last 3 years and all the things that have changed, you too have probably gone through some major changes. And when I think about the disciples, I think, if I would have experienced even one of Jesus' miracles, I think that probably would have made my list. So I wonder if their 3-year list would look something like, met a rabbi, he told me to stop fishing for fish and told me to start fishing for people, so I quit my day job, started following him, saw him heal a paralyzed man, saw him open the eyes of the blind, cast out my first demon, so that was pretty cool. Or maybe I saw him feed 5,000 people with a couple of loaves of bread and a few fish. I imagine following Jesus around for 3 years would be extremely transformative. And yet we come to passages like the one I'm going to read in a moment, and the disciples still don't get it. How infuriating is that? We have these people who have followed Jesus, who have walked with him, who have journeyed with him for 3 years now, and they are still so dull. So we're going to pick up our text this morning. We're going to be in the book of Luke, chapter 18. We're going to start at verse 31, and I'm going to take us through verse 34. Some of you are going, I know why you've been in Luke for 3 years. The words are going to come up on the screen, but also the page number on the screen is going to correlate to the paper Bible underneath the seat in front of you or around you, if you prefer. Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, and spit on him. They will flog him and kill him. On the 3rd day, he will rise again. The disciples did not understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from them. and they did not know what he was talking about. Now, I'm a pretty direct communicator, I've been told. And I think Jesus is really clear here. I deeply appreciate that. And so when the disciples still don't get it, it's a little irritating to me. I feel like if anyone should get it, the disciples should. But see, this is a theme that Luke has been building on throughout his gospel. Throughout his gospel, the people who should see Jesus, the people who should get it, don't. And the people we don't expect to get it, the people that we think, surely they're not going to understand what Jesus is saying, those are the people who get it. Last week, we met the rich young ruler. Now, this is the kind of guy that we all kind of want to hate, right? Like, he's good looking, he has power, he has money. He's, like, in that sense, very annoying. But what we get to know is he's actually a good person, we're told. He's actually been following the law. He's actually been doing the right things. Surely this is the kind of person who should get it. But when Jesus tells him to sell everything he has, give to the poor, and follow him, the cost of the kingdom is too high for this young man. So even though he's the kind of person that we want to be, that we think surely is in, as it turns out, he's the kind of person who goes away sad. Or this week, when we have the disciples, those people who have everything at their fingertips, those people who could ask Jesus any question in the world. Like, who hasn't ever had this moment where you just think, gosh, if I could just ask Jesus that one question face to face, that would be great. These are the people who have that opportunity, and yet they don't get it. Next week, as we continue in our text, we're going to come across a blind man. And we're not the only ones that are frustrated with the disciples. See, Luke has constructed his gospel in this way because he wants to contrast the disciples to this blind man. This blind man calls out to Jesus. He calls out who Jesus is. He calls Jesus the son of David, and Jesus heals him. Luke's point is this: the blind man sees and the disciples don't. Now, we might be tempted to think this is like a new theme that Luke is bringing to light. But this has actually happened a lot throughout our biblical text. In fact, from Israel's very origin story, we have those people who shouldn't see seeing God, and those people who should, who totally miss it. In Genesis 16, where we sort of have this origin story of Israel, God has come to this man Abram, and he said, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. I am going to multiply your children. I'm going to expand your territory. And Abram tells his wife Sarai this. Now, the problem is, Abram and Sarai have been trying to have children for years. And we're also told that Sarai's actually past her childbearing years. And so they don't see God's promise. Their expectations don't meet God's reality. So what Sarai does, feeling a little unsure of God's grasp on fertility, is she takes her maidservant Hagar, she brings her to Abram, and she says, build a family through Hagar. Now, when Hagar becomes pregnant, her and Sarah begin to quarrel, and then Hagar flees to the desert. And it's here in the desert with this vulnerable, pregnant slave woman that God shows up. She is maybe the last person in the world that we would expect to see this God of Israel. See, because not only is she a vulnerable, pregnant slave woman, on top of that, she's also the matriarch of Israel's future enemies. That baby inside of her stomach is going to become a nation that will war with Israel for as long as we've known history. So she's the last woman I would imagine to see God, and yet she does. And beyond just seeing God, Hagar is actually the first person in the Bible to name God. She says, I have now seen the God who sees me. And the funny thing about naming in the Bible is to name something is to truly capture its essence. When Sarai and Abraham miss it, Hagar gets it. She sees God. And so Luke is not doing something new when we come to his gospel. He's continuing this story of the unexpected, of that person we don't expect to see God, seeing God. Now, as Luke is doing this, he's also creating a little bit of urgency. See, one of the things Luke has done throughout his gospel is he's taken us on a physical journey with Jesus towards Jerusalem. Now, Jesus probably took several trips to Jerusalem as a good Jew. But for Luke, he tells us two main journeys to Jerusalem. The first one when Jesus is a child, and the second one that we have been on since about Luke, the end of chapter 9. We have been heading towards Jerusalem. Now, what we know as readers is what happens when Jesus reaches Jerusalem. We know that he is going to be crucified, that he's going to resurrect, and that his ministry is going to be handed off to the disciples. Now, today, we're right outside Jericho in this text we just picked up. That means we're about 18 miles from Jerusalem. We're getting really close now. And so urgency is starting to build because what you and I know is that Jesus' ministry is about to be handed off to these disciples who really don't get it. It's interesting because if we look at Luke and then his sequel, the Gospel of Acts, Luke does something very interesting with the gospel. See, it starts in Jesus' hometown in Galilee. They don't get it, so they move out towards Jerusalem. Then after that, when we get to the book of Acts, we're going to be told the gospel is going to go to Judea, to Samaria, and to what Luke refers to as the ends of the earth. See, he gives us these sort of concentric circles on this journey. Rather than the gospel coming in to those who are on the inside, those who we expect deserve and should get the gospel actually goes out. The gospel is a spreading and expansive good news. So here we are with the disciples. Jesus tells them very plainly, for the third time in Luke's story, what is about to happen, and they don't get it. Now, that part doesn't surprise me. What surprises me about this story is that they do not ask a single question. Now look, if you and I are on a journey and you tell me, hey, when we arrive, I am going to be beaten, murdered, and I'm going to rise again in 3 days, I might have a couple questions. Like, for starters, should we keep going? Are you sure you want to go? No? Okay, great. But the disciples don't ask any of these. Why? Because they're blind. And what they're blinded by is their own expectations. It's not because they didn't hear what Jesus said. It's because what they thought he said, what they heard from the prophets, was different. So when we look at this text, we now know from some of our overlapping scriptures with our Jewish brothers and sisters that Jesus is referring to Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Daniel 9, and probably some other of the Jewish scriptures that are not included in our text. Now, what's interesting about those passages I just mentioned is they are part of a very particular genre within our biblical scriptures. That genre is apocalyptic literature. Now, some of you, I see you shifting in your seats because we also have some expectations around apocalyptic literature. This is generally a genre of the Bible we sort of avoid because it's uncomfortable, and what we have been taught about the apocalypse or the end has often missed the point. And we've missed the point because we don't understand where this genre actually came from. See, we don't have a lot of apocalyptic literature in our Old Testament because it actually came to rise during the Second Temple era. So when Israel is in captivity, when they are under empire after empire after empire, this genre starts to rise. This genre is often in metaphors. Now, if you grew up like I did, when you encounter apocalyptic literature, You may have been introduced to things like the Left Behind series, okay? Yep, shout out to the Left Behind series. Okay, if you are unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, I'm going to give you a really abbreviated version of this theological theory. Basically, some theologians have said at the end times, when God comes back to judge the world, it would be really uncomfortable for those of us who are Christians, those of us who are on the inside, those of us who obviously got it, to be there for that judgment, for the tribulations. So somebody decided what God is actually going to do is he's going to take those who are on the inside to heaven, and they're going to miss all that. Now, unfortunately, someone picked up on this idea, and they said, what if I'm actually not on the inside? What if I'm on the outside? What if I think that I'm going to be one of the people brought up, but I'm not? What if I'm left behind? Now, if you missed this whole era of Christianity, don't worry. Hollywood picked up on this for us. And there is a whole Left Behind series that you can watch, and you too can experience the trauma that some of us experienced growing up. Now, you think I'm kidding, but my freshman year of Bible college, probably like my first or second week of school, okay? Mind you, I have not taken any biblical courses to this point, okay? I'm driving back from the beach with some of my peers, and a couple of my new friends have fallen asleep in the back of my car. But they're sort of like slumped over in a position that, unless you're in college, you're never getting out of. So when I glance in the rearview mirror, I can't see them. Now, any rational human being that does not have this small t trauma that I have is just going to look in the rearview mirror again and see that they're asleep and they're just slumped down. Not me. Nope. My immediate thought is, oh my God, I've been left behind. And then immediately feeling bad that I just said that, right? Like, oh, this is why. This is why I'm still here and they got taken up. Now, a couple more weeks of Bible college, couple more biblical courses. It's not quite how I picture the end anymore. But that was what most of us were exposed to when we talked about apocalyptic literature. This is not how the disciples are encountering this kind of scripture or this kind of writing. One scholar has put it this way: it is not accidental that the first extant examples of the literary genre apocalypse emerge in the Hellenistic period, an era marked by a new internationalism, as well as by continuous warfare, military occupation, and reconquest of Judea and the surrounding territories. Conquest created empire. Ongoing military activity, occupation, taxation, tribute, and colonial power maintained it. The earliest apocalypses did not merely take shape within this new imperial context, they resisted it. So when we come to apocalyptic literature, we should keep in mind that where we have seen monsters, they saw metaphors. They understood that what they were doing was resisting empire. Apocalyptic literature is actually literature of hope. Apocalyptic literature to the disciples, especially in passages like Isaiah 53, would have been looking forward to the resurrection of Israel. See, what they understood the Messiah was going to come and do was going to lead Israel through a political victory. That this Messiah was going to put them back in power. That is what they understood when they read passages like Isaiah 53. Now, I'm going to read you just a little snippet of Isaiah 53 to give you an idea if you're not familiar with this passage. I will start in verse 3, and I'll just read 3 or 4 verses here. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our sufferings. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Again, when we read passages like this one, we are looking back and we are thinking about our Savior, who we know as Jesus Christ. We are thinking about what he did on the cross. But if we were looking forward to this with our Jewish brothers and sisters, we would not have understood the suffering servant to have been a person. We would have understood the suffering servant to be the nation of Israel, that the nation of Israel was already suffering, that being under empire was their suffering. What they were looking forward to was the resurrection of Israel. And yes, by this time in history, the Jewish faith had evolved to have some idea of a bodily resurrection, at least among some sects, but not all. And the overarching belief was that Israel was the suffering servant. Now, I realize I just said a lot about apocalyptic literature, and I thought it might be a little fun this morning to play with a bit of AI. So I asked that AI would kind of solidify this, put it in picture form for us. So I have two images for you. The first one, I asked that AI would generate an image for me of what the ancient Jewish people believed the Messiah's coming was going to look like. And this is the picture that I got. This is how they interacted with apocalyptic literature. Now, with our passage today, I think the only thing we could add to this is the disciples probably pictured one of them on the right and one of them on the left in power. This was what they were expecting when they got to Jerusalem. Okay. Now, the second image I asked AI for, just as a comparison, could you give me an image of how 21st century Christians have interacted with the apocalyptic genre of literature from the ancient Jews? And this is the picture that it gave me. Just for funsies. Now, as I look at these images, well, certainly the second one is a bit funny, I also can't help but think about expectations. We have lots of expectations. I actually do have expectations for what I think it will be like to meet Jesus face to face. You probably do too. For our disciples, they clearly had an image in mind of what they thought it would be like when they met the Messiah, when they got to Jerusalem. But my question is this: what happens when our expectations are left unmet? You know, so often I have found in my own faith journey that my expectations are built on what I think God should do. Another way I could put that, a lot of times my expectations are built on this idea of if I was God, I would do it like this. In fact, there's been several times when I have thought of unanswered prayers and I have looked at God and been like, look, bro, I don't know what you're doing, but here is what I asked for, and this is what I think we should have done. I think part of our spiritual maturity is being able to die to my own expectations. Coming to the realization that God doing it the way that I want him to do it is not the best way. The cross, that's not how I would have done it. The cross is so much better than how I would have done it. The cross is so much better than how the disciples wanted him to do it. What they thought they needed to be saved from was empire. What they actually needed to be saved from was the brokenness of this world, including their own brokenness. The cross does more than we ever would have asked for, and it costs us so much more than we thought we were willing to give. Christian maturity is this realization that we're not just looking towards resurrection, We are in this cycle of death and resurrection and death and resurrection and death and resurrection because that is the way that God is forming each of us. Now, sometimes when I'm just looking to the end, that's easy to swallow. But what about in my daily life? What about when God doesn't do things the way I think he should do them now? Then what happens? So many of us as Christians, that sends us running. When our jobs don't work out the way they're supposed to. When we're waiting for that child we have prayed for years and years, and it's not showing up when we're expecting. When we're praying for healing, and instead we're facing chronic illness and maybe even terminal illness. I don't know what it is that you are expecting from God. But what I know is what we signed up for is this cycle of death and resurrection and death and resurrection and death and resurrection. And the way that God is going to do it is so much better than you or I is going to do it. I'm going to invite our worship team up as we prepare for Eucharist. And I want us to sit with a couple questions. I want us to think about what are the expectations that you have had for God that have gone unmet. Have you taken time to grieve the way you thought it should have been done? How do we prepare our hearts for not just resurrection, but for this cycle of death and resurrection that we have been invited to as God creates in us more Christ-like beings? Maybe your expectations haven't gone unmet yet, but what if they do? What does it look like to bury my expectations and rest in the hope that we serve a good and loving God? Let's pray. God, I thank you that you are a God whose way is better than my way. God, I do lay down my expectations at your feet, and Lord, I ask you to invite me to lay them down over and over and over again. God, would we rest in your character? Would we rest in the fact that you are a God who is always writing a better story than we could have hoped or imagined? That you are the God who sees us, that you are the God who comes to us, that you are the God that is restoring all things, even when we don't know what that journey looks like. Amen. As we come to the table, like we do each time that we meet together, I'm struck with the reality that this is always an invitation to lay down our expectations. This is always an invitation to reflect on what God is asking me to die to right now, so that he can resurrect something new. Now, here at DCC, we participate in what is called open table communion. That means everybody is welcome. This isn't our table as a church, this is God's table. And if we know anything from the biblical text, God goes out to all of us. God is a God who is for all of us. God is a God who is inviting us all to sit at the table with him. So I'd like you all to come as you are led and take a moment and just reflect on what it is to die to your expectations today.